All right, welcome to Lesson 2 from English 271, Intro to Poetry. I'm Dr. MHohner, and today we're going to be talking about two of the most pivotal moments in the history of poetry. First, we're going to start off with the ancient Greek culture and epic or narrative poetry. We're going to focus specifically on Homer's The Odyssey for this portion. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, for this course, we're going to move chronologically, starting with this lesson. So we'll first look at the ancient Greeks in epic or narrative poetry, and then we'll move quite a bit ahead in time, but still pretty far back from the present day, to the literary movement known as the Renaissance. Some scholars call it the early modern period, that was prominent in the 16th century and then into the 17th century. So like I said, these are two of the biggest, most pivotal developments in the history of poetry. So we need to understand them before we move forward into more recent time periods to know how they've shaped the literary genre of poetry. For part 2, when we look at the Renaissance in the 17th century, there's two specific movements we'll look at. The first is the development and rise of the sonnet, especially through Shakespeare's sonnets, which are the most popular sonnets. And then the second is the emergence of the metaphysical poets and their use of the poetical concept conceit in the 17th century. That's the plan for this lesson. Once we finish this lesson, we'll be able to go into more recent time periods. In lesson 3, we'll look at the Romantics, which that's a literary movement from the end of the 18th century, start of the 19th century, so just a couple hundred years ago. And then lesson 3, lesson 4/5, lesson 6, and lesson 7 will move sequentially from Romanticism to Victorianism to Modernism to the present. Those movements all immediately following each other. But first, these two much earlier movements are very important for understanding poetry as we know it today. First, epic or narrative poetry. And for our specific case study to see an example of epic or narrative poetry, we're going to look at the Odyssey by Homer and focus on the protagonist Ulysses and his journey to help us understand why narrative or epic poetry is important and how the Odyssey as our case study is one of the most, probably the most influential example of epic narrative poetry. I don't think any other epic narrative poem has had quite the impact and influence that the Odyssey has had. We'll talk about why as we work through our slides here. So, as a quick reminder, quick recall from our first lesson, there's 3 types of poetry: narrative poetry, which is often called epic poetry, dramatic poetry, and lyric poetry. Most of what we read this quarter will be lyric poetry, which are the short poems you're used to seeing that focus usually on a single subject, having to do with ideas or emotions, and then use imagery and other language to express the author's thoughts on that subject matter. Narrative poetry, on the other hand, are long poems for the most part that tell a story rather than describe a subject. They originated with ancient epics like this one. Other examples would be the Iliad, which is Homer's earlier work. The Iliad precedes the Odyssey. You could almost say the Odyssey is a sequel to the Iliad. And then other famous examples would be the Aeneid and the Metamorphosis from the Roman literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, especially the Inferno, but Dante's Divine Comedy from Italy, Milton's Paradise Lost, Beowulf. Those are some classic examples. Now, narrative poetry does not have to be that long. I mean, those are all, you could say, novel-length poems. But it does need to be on the longer side, and it does need to have a narrative driving force: protagonist, antagonist, rising action, falling action. So that driving force of narrative that we're more familiar with from fiction. Some shorter examples that are more recent would include The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which we'll study in detail in lesson 3. So hopefully those examples kind of help orient you here. You probably have some exposure to the ancient epics. In 1990, a poet named Derek Walcott, who's actually the final poet we'll study at the end of lesson 7, published an epic poem called Omeros, which is basically a retelling of the Odyssey set in a post-colonial setting on a Caribbean island, St. Lucia. So right there you already have an example of the lasting influence of the Odyssey, a post-colonial author in his take on the epic poem did a reworking, a retelling of the Odyssey. So, but what makes it poetry? Well, if you think about the kind of culture it came from 7,000 years ago in ancient Greek society, it was a culture that depended primarily on oral, or you could say verbal storytelling, right? Today we have things like Netflix and novels to keep us entertained. This is even before the printing press and definitely before widespread literacy. So most stories for entertainment were spoken out loud. And you wanted something long enough to be interesting and engaging, like watching a movie or something. So how would you remember a poem that long? How would you remember a poem as long as the Odyssey to say it out loud? Well, you would use the language of poetry because there's certain aspects of it, rhyming, rhythm, sound, even meter, to help you remember the words. And so if we were reading this in the ancient Greek rather than an English translation, we would be getting that sound, that feel. Now, I think even in translation, some of that is still present, which I'll talk about when I do my sample closer reading. And I actually have one of your discussion board questions asks you if you want to talk about the language and how even though when you read this, it kind of feels like reading a short story or a novel, there's still a poetic force to it. If you want to talk about that in your discussion board, I would love to read it. So it reads like fiction, but it has that poetic element of language. And so we can't just dismiss it in a class like this. We need to study it as poetry to see the impact it has had on the genre. And a question that I think comes to my mind that I think is really interesting is why would someone today choose to tell a story in verse form rather than prose? So narrative poetry hasn't died out completely. Lyric poetry is certainly the most prominent form today, but people are still writing narrative poems. And this is just food for thought. Feel free to bring it up in the discussion board. But what I'm getting at is it's not just remembering it that's important here. There's something powerful going on with the language. Okay, so here we go. We're going to dive into the Odyssey. My goal is to show you how the Odyssey, a text that may not be super accessible to you, the impact it had both in its own culture in ancient Greece several thousand years ago, and the lasting impact it's had today. We can't skip over it in a class like this. We can't skip over it in a class like this, one, because it's narrative epic poetry, so we need to see how that style of poetry contributes to our overall study of poetry. But moreover, we have the Odyssey specifically as a case study. I could have chosen the Iliad or the Aeneid or Paradise Lost or any of those examples. Instead, I've chosen the Odyssey. Why? It's a unique, singular text, and I hope through the next few slides to unveil the reasons why it's a unique, singular text to you. But you don't have to look very far, even at our reading list this quarter, to see the impact it has had on global literature. So many later works reference and allude to this text. It has had a lasting impact. So what makes it something that authors would want to continue to refer back to in their own creative works? To start, we need context. We're only looking at books 5 and 6. I would have loved to assign the whole thing to you, but we don't have much time. And I would have take a few weeks to read the whole thing. So I just gave you books 5 and 6, but we're going to real quickly go over an outline of the entire plot and the structure to help situate books 5 and 6 for you and to give you a larger understanding of what happens around the books you read for class today. It's important to know that the Odyssey is divided up into 24 books, which when you have poetry as the means of storytelling, they call them books instead of chapters, but they essentially function like chapters. And 24 is important because Homer is very strategic in his dividing up of the books, and they usually are in units of 4. So I'm going to use that metric essentially as my guideline here. Books 1 through 4 tell about Telemachus' son from his perspective. Telemachus, Ulysses' son, from his perspective. I need to note real quickly that our translation by Samuel Butler uses the Latin name Ulysses instead of Odysseus, so most slides should say Ulysses. I think Odysseus today is more common culturally, but Butler's translation is not only very good, it's also the one that's available free online. So I'll use Ulysses the rest of the slides for clarity. But his son, Telemachus, is at home in Ithaca. That's how it opens for the first 4 books. The context here, it's a sequel essentially to the Iliad. The Iliad told the story of the Trojan War. The Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus or Ulysses' journey home from the Trojan War. The Trojan War lasted 10 years, and then his journey home lasts another 10 years. So he's essentially been gone 20 years. He was sort of a minor character in the Iliad, a general in the Greek army, and now he's the main character here. Something that's really interesting about the Odyssey, that's one of the things that sets it apart from other epic poems, is that it does not tell the events in a linear order. Think about shows and movies today where you open up with a scene that's very intense and dramatic, and it's near the end of the narrative, and then after that short scene you go backward in time and get the rest of the narrative. The Odyssey basically invented that strategy several thousand years ago. And so we have the context that this is about Ulysses traveling home after the war, and it takes him 10 years, another 10 years to get home. But it opens with his son, showing what life is like in Ithaca. His wife, Penelope, his son, Telemachus, and he was the king of Ithaca. So there's a group of suitors who want to use the opportunity of his absence to seize the throne. And that sets the tension of what was happening at home while he was gone. But in Telemachus here in these opening books appeals to the gods for help to get his father home. But it's very close to the end of the 10 years, very close to when Ulysses actually gets home. So after that, setting the scene in the first 4-book unit, we then get our first look at Ulysses, which is why we're reading books 5 and 6. I could have chosen any of the books. 5 and 6 really give us examples of the larger narrative in miniature, and they give us our first actual glimpse of Ulysses in the text. So that seemed like as good a place as any for us to place our focus. But even then, we're not going back. This isn't the moment he left Troy. This is not quite, but very parallel to Telemachus' timeline. This is right before Ulysses gets home. This is one of his last stops on his journey, and he's already lost all of his men. It's just him, so he's alone on this island with Calypso. And we'll talk more about this scene because that's our main focus when we do the close reading. But the gods help him get off that island, and he next ends up with the Phaeacians. So books 5 to 8 form a 4-book unit where we see Ulysses' last steps before he gets home and how he gets home. When he's with the Phaeacians, who are a very advanced culture, they host him. There's a theme of hospitality. There's also a theme of athletic competition and storytelling. He impresses them with his athletic feats, and they ask him to recount the events of his journey. So the next 4-book unit, 9 to 12, then Ulysses tells the story of his journey to the Phaeacians. And what's interesting here is these scenes are the most famous scenes from the Odyssey, the ones that are referenced most frequently culturally, but they only account for 4 out of the 24 books, and they're told by Ulysses to the Phaeacians. So we have a very unreliable narrator telling about these most famous events, but they include the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops. So the Cyclops is named Polyphemus, and Ulysses blinds the Cyclops when his men are trying to escape, so the Cyclops doesn't eat them. But as they're sailing away, he calls out his name, essentially to gloat, to brag, having bested the Cyclops. And this is a moment of Ulysses' pride, and one of the indicators that this journey, since this is still fairly early on, and it will be about his character growth, because now Poseidon, the sea god, the Cyclops Polyphemus' father, knows who blinded his son, and Poseidon promises vengeance. So it is Poseidon and the sea god, they're sailing right, who makes Odysseus' journey so difficult. And then other other famous scenes from his journey: the interaction with Circe. He visits the underworld, obviously the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis. But finally, he gets to the end of recounting his narrative, and the Phaeacians are so impressed with his storytelling ability that they give him a ship home. In the second half of the poem, the timelines converge. In the other 12 books, books 13 to 24, are about how once home, Ulysses battles the suitors and reclaims the throne. So this non-linear form of storytelling allows Homer to emphasize certain elements. And what we have is really interesting. The previous poem, the Iliad, told about the Trojan War, right? And the main character there was Achilles, who's this great warrior. Now, Ulysses is a fine warrior. He holds his own, competing athletically with the Phaeacians, but he's a different kind of hero. He's much smarter than Achilles, but not nearly as strong. He's wise, he's cunning. He's a great rhetorician and speaker. And so we have a different kind of a story. Instead of a story about war and about human interactions, more surface level, what we have here is more interior human interactions. We get the psychology, the emotion that you don't get as much in the Iliad. So it's a story about how Odysseus grows as a person, especially through his interactions with other people, with a unique window inside his mind, his heart, his soul, and also the souls and hearts of other characters. Calypso, for instance, in the scene we are about to look at, or especially Penelope and Telemachus. So right there you start to see why this is such a singular and influential text, for those reasons I just gave. So what are some of the themes we're going to look at here? As I alluded to a minute ago, the journey is more important than the destination. He needs to reclaim his throne, and that finally happens in books 24, but getting there is what transforms him as an individual. So the journey is more important than the destination. And he spends those 10 years traveling all around the Mediterranean. He's shipwrecked multiple times. He has to backtrack, so it shouldn't take 10 years to get from Troy to Ithaca. Think of, as a comparison, the Israelites in the Old Testament and the story of Exodus. It should have only taken them, I think, 10 or 20 days, I don't remember exactly, but a short time period, basically 2 or 3 weeks, to travel from Egypt to the Promised Land, but instead it takes 40 years because they're disobedient. God's punishing them, but they often retread the same ground. A lot of differences, but similar here with Ulysses, if that's a helpful illustration, where because he's been prideful and boasted about his victory over the Cyclops, the sea god is angry and is making his journey more difficult. And so it takes longer than it should. But that opens up the room for all these interactions with all these different types of characters, such as Calypso and the Phaeacians and Circe, etc., and then for his character growth and development. So when we study the Odyssey, then, what we can ask is, what do we learn from Ulysses' travels, trials, and triumphs? Now, we're not reading the whole text, but we can essentially ask the same question of books 5 and 6, because they enact the larger narrative in miniature. In other words, we see the trial of him being on Calypso's island. We see the triumph of him making it off the island. We see his interactions with Calypso in Nausicaa, so you get that variety of characters, you get that window into his soul, you get both his struggle and his triumph all in 2 books. So we can ask the big questions we ask about the Odyssey, we can ask them just about these 2 books. And then by reading just 2 books, we can see how the Odyssey was influential on culture and poetry. Some of the themes that emerge. You can study the Odyssey as a cultural artifact. It's a window into Greek culture, but it also has these universal themes that transcend Greek culture. Some of those themes are faith. Now, when you look at themes, you have to keep in mind that a theme is not a meaning or a message. It's not an interpretation. It's a recurring idea or trope. A meaning, a message, which is when you say this is the meaning or message of the text, you're making an interpretation, is answering the question, what does the text say about faith? And that's what I'm going to do when I do a sample close reading in just a minute, is take on the theme of faith, but give an interpretation of how the poem addresses it. But here are some other ones. And there'll be plenty for you to talk about in your discussion board post that I don't cover here. Storytelling is so important. In this case, you often have an unreliable narrator. Hospitality was very important. We see in books 7 and 8 the Phaeacians being very hospitable to Ulysses, because you never knew if a stranger were really a Greek god in disguise. Gender roles, absolutely pivotal. The Odyssey does problematic but also fascinating things with gender roles. And human relationships, the Phaeacians, Calypso, Circe, these are very different types of characters. And so seeing how Ulysses interacts with them and how he changes and what they're like over the course of his journey really reveals a lot about the human condition, but how humans interact with each other in different ways and not just in warfare ways like in the Iliad. Okay, so as I tried to point out in the previous lesson, I'm going to do some close reading to give you a sample, at least probably twice per lesson, because we'll usually have 2 parts to each lesson. But then I'm going to just do a little bit and try to leave a lot left for you to interpret in your discussion board posts, as I did with the sound of silence in the previous lesson. So what I want to zoom in on here, just as a subject I think is interesting for a sample close reading, is what is essentially a double standard, in that Ulysses clearly has an intimate relationship with Calypso, or he's been having one because he's been on her island for, I can't remember how long, but clearly a long time when book 5 opens up. Yet Penelope back home has to be true to her wedding vow. So this is very much a double standard, not surprising coming out of a male-dominated Greek culture. But how do we reconcile this? We're certainly not supposed to just think Ulysses is a great character. He's a very flawed character. That's part of what makes him interesting to study. And as a married man who's very devoted to my wife, this really bothers me, even though I think the Odyssey is a powerful and compelling text. So I want to pull on this thread and study it more. And so here's a passage that'll help us do that. This is when Calypso and Ulysses are interacting right before he leaves the island, and Calypso says, "Ulysses, noble son of Laertes, so you would start home to your own land at once? Good luck go with you. But if you could only know how much suffering is in store for you before you get back to your own country, you would stay where you are, keep house along with me, and let me make you immortal, no matter how anxious you may be to see this wife of yours, of whom you are thinking all the time, day after day. Yet I flatter myself that I am no whit less tall or well-looking than she is, for it is not to be expected that a mortal woman should compare in beauty with an immortal." "Goddess," replied Ulysses, "do not be angry with me about this. I am quite aware that my wife Penelope is nothing like so tall or so beautiful as yourself. She is only a woman, whereas you are immortal. Nevertheless, I want to get home, and can think of nothing else. If some god wrecks me when I am on the sea, I will bear it, and make the best. I have had infinite trouble both by land and sea already, so let this go with the rest." So how do we interpret this passage? I have two things for you. The first is more of an observation, and the second is a bigger idea that I can develop further that will be an illustration of you for you to help you kind of write your discussion board post. The first is that, like I said earlier, Ulysses is a different kind of hero. He is cunning and wise rather than a great warrior. His physical abilities can help him sometimes, but his words help him more often. You see this especially when he interacts with Nausicaa for the first time, the princess of the Phaeacians, in book 6. And that's definitely something you could write about in your post, because I don't really address it here. But here, he doesn't actually feel this way. He much prefers his wife to Calypso. But he still says, I am quite aware that my wife, Penelope, is nothing like so tall or so beautiful as yourself. So instead of fighting his way off this island, he's very diplomatic. Now, that could easily be developed into a paper topic, but for now, I just wanted to kind of give you an observation. I wanted to give you a couple things I observed. The second one, though, is the idea, like if I were to write a paper, for instance, on the Odyssey, I'd probably develop this further. And here's the idea. And you can see here how I've laid it out, where you have the message, so that's my interpretation, textual support, and then a quote. Or a textual support is a quote, and then an explanation, an analysis of the quote to show how it proves the idea from my message. So that's to be kind of a model for you to use when you're writing both your discussion boards and your papers, and any paper in any literary analysis class. So give your interpretation, give textual support in the form of a quotation, and then explain how the textual support proves your idea, your interpretation of the message. And you'll want to do more than one sentence of analysis explanation. I'm just going quick here. So I argue that the Odyssey emphasizes the importance of faith. He says, nevertheless, I want to get home and can think of nothing else. If some god wrecks me when I am on the sea, I will bear it and make the best of it. Now, Ulysses is not true to his wedding vow, but he is true to his vow to return home, even though the journey will cause him great suffering. So I disagree with Greek culture. I do not think there should be a double standard for men and women when it comes to marital fidelity. But this text is produced from within Greek culture. So what we see is within that culture where there's a double standard, Ulysses' vow is different. His vow is to get home. Her vow is to maintain marital fidelity. So both Ulysses and Penelope have different vows within that cultural context, but they both keep their vows. And so that's how it can be a story about the importance of faith, even when you have a character who isn't maritally faithful, which still bothers me, but sometimes stories present conflicting views. And here's an instance of how to reconcile them by looking at the culture and saying, what is the author trying to convey? And from that approach, we get this emphasis on the importance of faith. So that's my argument. Now, this is just one example of how to make interpretations and support them. There's so much rich material in the Odyssey that there's plenty for you to write about. You can write about the poetry of the language. You can write about his interactions with Nausicaa. You can write about his interactions with other people. One thing I think is really interesting, I almost used here, is Calypso's speech to the gods, where she essentially critiques this double standard. And so you have the actions of Ulysses supporting the double standard of Greek culture, and you have the words of Calypso critiquing the double standard of Greek culture when it comes to marital fidelity in men and women. So it's really interesting then, which view do you think the text actually puts as preeminent? You could probably make the case either way, and sometimes texts have contradictory messages. But that's part of the fun of playing around and seeing those different things and analyzing them. So I very much look forward to seeing and reading, your interpretations of the Odyssey, but with what I've presented here, hopefully you see how it's a powerful poem, a powerful story, And because it's this type of story that has been so influential, but it's a poem, its contributions as an example of epic or narrative poetry have really shaped the genre of poetry. Now, moving along, we're going to jump several thousand years in the future, but to a time period that's still pretty old, 500 years old. And we're going to look at two movements. First, the rise of the sonnet and its popularity through the end of the 16th century, and then the emergence of the metaphysical poets at the beginning of the 17th century. And here we have a picture of a two-legged compass, which is the conceit or the illustration that John Donne uses in his poem Valediction Forbidden Morning, which is what we'll use for our sample close reading on the metaphysical poets. Okay. Before we get to the poetry itself, I want to talk about some of the things that inform it. So in the previous lesson, we looked in detail at figurative language, the dramatic situation, and the different types of poetry. Those are all essential terms to understanding and interpreting poetry. Remember, I said poetry is very technical, so we have to learn all these terms and ideally incorporate them into our analysis. Remember how I incorporated irony into my analysis of the sound of silence? As we go through these lectures, specifically the first 3 lectures, they're a little bit longer, as you can tell. Today, this one's longer because I'm covering 2 really pivotal moments in the history of poetry, but also because I'm incorporating these poetic elements. After the midterm, those will start to fall off because we'll have covered them all, and we'll do more just poems, and the lectures will be much shorter. But today we're looking at meter and scansion. Meter is just the measuring poetry. And you think about poetry, it's all about language, right? I said last time it's almost like a foreign language because it's this poetic language. So it sounds weird, but as a way to try to understand that language, the language of poetry and how it works, we need to measure it. There's 4 ways of measuring it. We can measure the syllables. We can measure the accents. Now, there's an accent for every syllable, but we group them together. So we measure that a little different. I'll say more on that in a minute. We can count both the accents and syllables, and then you can measure the duration of words. Now, this information is all from the handout from Purdue OWL, but I'm trying to break it down for you. English is a predominantly accentual language, because it's a Germanic language, which means it makes more sense for us to measure the accents rather than the syllables. So typically we measure either the accents or the accents and syllables together, but not just the syllables and not the duration of the words. Other cultures, other languages tend to do those things more. When you measure poems, you eventually see something called poetic feet, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And with poetic feet, there's different kind of units of poetic feet. The most common form is called iambic pentameter. We're going to really unpack that on the next couple slides. You probably heard it before, but this example down here is an example in iambic pentameter. And you can see the difference between syllables and accents. So iambic pentameter means there's always 10 syllables, but only 5 sets of accents in each line. And a foot of poetry is when you the accents group together. You see how it's divided up there on that example. So in iambic pentameter, for instance, it goes from unaccented to accented, and every time it does that, that's a poetic foot. And so there's 5 feet, 10 syllables there. That's how we would count or measure the meter. And then I'm going to read it. I'm not the best reader. You should read it yourself too. You should listen to recordings of the poems. There's a lot of them available on the readings I've given you. But here goes. This sun light shames November where he grieves. So I tried to do the accents correctly. Excuse me. It becomes second nature to us as we read a lot, and you're probably all big readers if you're taking this class, but it's great to read it out loud and to play around with the sum and try to see, even if I read it because I just naturally feel the rhythm and I read it perfectly without even looking at the meter and scansion, Scansion is where you actually mark it out the way this graphic is done. Um, if you take some time and do that, you don't have to do it with every poem, but remember in the last lesson I talked about spending a lot of time on each poem, like even 15 to 20 minutes, even if it's a short 12 or 14 line poem. For some of them, try to do this and try to see sort of the structure behind the language that you're reading, so you really get a feel for the sound and the rhythm. So those units I just showed you there, every time you measure the accents together, those sets of syllables, those are called feet. And there's 4 type of feet. Iambic is 2 syllables that go from unaccented to accented. Anapestic go unaccented, unaccented, accented. Then trochaic is just the reverse of iambic, and dactylic is just the reverse of anapestic. So there are obviously others. These are the 4 most common, and iambic is really common. Then there's line length. So a foot is a monometer, 2 feet is a dimeter, etc. So a pentameter, again, the most common one would be, 5 feet, which would be 10 syllables per line. So if you match these up, you can then see what iambic pentameter is from this chart, right? Iambic pentameter means it's 5 feet / accents, or 10 syllables per line, and you go in the feet, you go from unaccented to accented in that sequence. So now we know what iambic pentameter is, and it's the most common one. But again, play around with this. Try out, what is anapestic trimeter? What is trochaic tetrameter? So on and so forth. And you get some really interesting things. If you start getting the anapestics and the dactylics in there, you're getting a lot more syllables, longer lines. So it can be really interesting. Play around with it. Write your own poems. At the end of the quarter, I'll give you extra credit for writing your own poem. As you read the poems, try to identify what these are. It'll really help you appreciate the language more and help you get into the poems more. Now we're about to study the sonnet, which is a specific closed form of poetry. More on that in a second. But a sonnet is always in iambic pentameter, which again is the most common one. And as a reminder, that means it's 5 feet, or 5 sets of accented syllables, so 10 syllables with each one going from unaccented to accented. All right, so the sonnet. Now, with poetry, there's closed forms of poetry and nonce forms. Nonce forms are basically open forms, what you think of if you've heard phrases like blank verse, where the poet basically does whatever she wants. And so it may seem irregular at first. It's highly organic. Prominent examples would be like Walt Whitman and a lot of contemporary poetry, because people are moving away from the forms, the closed forms, more. But you still see a lot of closed forms. A sonnet is an example of a closed form, which means there's a specific, in some cases, a highly specific set of rules that the poet has to follow to meet the criteria for that form and for it to be an example of that form. And the sonnet is a highly specific closed form. There's a lot of guidelines. Another example is a villanelle. There was an additional PowerPoint I included from Purdue Owl with your reading for lesson 1. There was a lot to take in there, so you may not have swallowed this, but it outlines the sonnet and the villanelle as 2 really closed forms with really specific guidelines. And later in the quarter, we'll read one of my favorite poems, One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which is a good example of a villanelle. One of the most famous poems ever. Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas is another villanelle. But today we're looking at the sonnet, which is the most widely used closed form. What its form consists of is 14 lines in iambic pentameter with a final heroic couplet, meaning the last 2 lines. A couplet would be 2 lines. So you have stanzas, and there's a certain number of lines in different stanzas, and there's different names for how many lines are in a stanza. So if a stanza is only 2 lines, it's a couplet. And by heroic, it means it's really set aside. Those last 2 lines really stand out. And then it has a rhyme scheme where it's just alternating rhymes with new rhymes each stanza, and then that couplet rhymes. And if you read the Shakespeare poems, you'll see that it does this. It's pretty amazing that poets like Shakespeare can follow this criteria so closely and meet it so well with these powerful emotional poems. The sonnet originated in Italy, and the Italian sonnet had a structure of 2 stanzas, 8 lines, and then 6 lines, whereas when English poets adapted it from the Italian, they changed the form to 3 4-line stanzas with that concluding couplet. Now this is really important. The Italian word volta means a turn or a surprise, like a twist ending. And that always is part of the sonnet. In the Italian, it comes starting in line 9, and in English, it comes in that last couplet, lines 13 and 14, again, really making it feel like a heroic couplet. It stands out. So the sonnet is still around today. One of my favorite examples of a more recent sonnet from the 20th century is Robert Frost's poem Design. It's about a spider in the woods. Doesn't sound anything like Renaissance poetry, but if you look at it, it meets these criteria. So it's very clearly a sonnet. And again, I'll give extra credit for writing a poem at the end of the quarter. It can be nonce form, it can be whatever you want. But if you want to challenge yourself and try to write a sonnet or a villanelle, that can be really fun. You might even just do it for fun if you like poetry. So how did the sonnet come about? It started with the author Petrarch, who invented the sonnet in Italy, in authors writing what are called sonnet sequences. So Petrarch and authors like him would write several hundred poems that would be published together as a sequence, and they would loosely tell a narrative if you read all the poems in order. Not a great narrative, not like narrative poetry, but they would basically tell kind of a story over the course of the sequence. And all the poems were dedicated to an unattainable beloved. These were mostly written by men, although there are some great sonnets that I couldn't get for a class because I couldn't get the right translations for free, and I didn't want to charge you for a textbook. But there are some great sonnets written by women, but they were predominantly written by men. And so the unattainable beloved is often a woman. So it's this beautiful, perfect, ideal woman that the man is, quite frankly, obsessed with and writes several hundred poems dedicated to her. But she's not real. She's not attainable. But there was something at that time and place in culture and history, that kind of focus on this unattainable beloved brought out this certain emotional position in poetry that became really popular, and you had lots and lots of sonnet sequences being written for, I think, over like 200 years in the 15th and 16th centuries, maybe as far back as the 14th century. And so it was incredibly popular. Today, I would say the content of it, of a typical sonnet sequence, certainly not all of them, was very problematic because it tended to focus on the exterior of the woman. It basically objectified her, held her to an ideal standard and objectified her. It would often go through and away and describe her hair and then her eyes and then other parts of her body, and not look at her as a whole woman, but basically fragment her body. And so obviously very problematic. What's cool about Shakespeare, though, is he adapted this form but then modified the themes. So his sonnets, and he was one of the last sonnet writers at the end of the 16th century, very much mimic this form. And if you don't look closely, they look just like the typical sonnets of the 15th and 16th centuries, but then he modifies the themes. His aren't dedicated to just one beloved. There's a dark lady who shows up at various points, but there's other people they're addressed to. Sometimes it's not clear who they're addressed to, and you get him playing around with the themes, often even critiquing or subverting them, as we'll see right now. So Shakespeare, coming out of that time, his most famous sonnet, 116, is considered like this great, maybe the most romantic poem ever. Love is an ever fixed mark. And so there's people who think that the language of it critiques that sonnet tradition I just described. Other people think it upholds it. Again, I love to hear what you think in the discussion board posts. Sonnet 130 seems like a sonnet that very obviously critiques the tradition, but that's my take and my close reading, but I've seen a wide variety of interpretations of it. But I'm going to give you my close reading now, again, as an example for this part of the lecture, and I'm going to do my best to read it in iambic pentameter. Again, read it yourself, listen to recordings. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress when she walks treads on the ground. And yet by heaven I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So Shakespeare draws upon the tradition very clearly, but um, he's going through her body piece by piece here, but he's not complimenting her. And so at first it sounds really degrading, but it's a comparison, right? Those other women from those other sonnet sequences were fiction. They're made up, they're ideals. So they're like goddesses, like line 11 tells us. But goddesses aren't real, is I think the argument he's making here. So by comparison, just a regular woman is not going to look like a goddess, but that means she's a real woman. So by comparison, this is how she would look. But because she's real, he can actually love her, not just idealize or objectify her. That's why his love is rare in this cultural context, and why he really does love her. So in mocking that tradition, he actually does what the tradition claims to do, but never actually lives up to. That's my interpretation. Again, I've read many great student papers on this over the years and read great, well-supported interpretations that go very different directions. Some people think this poem is very objectifying. Some people think it does further that tradition, but others have other wild takes on it. In my classes, there are no bad arguments, only poorly defended ones. So it's all about your ability to take the language of the text and use logical reasoning to explain how the language of the text supports what you think the text is saying. And again, I'll give you feedback all throughout the quarter to help you improve at doing that. And I love hearing what either you think of this sonnet or of Sonnet 116, or there's another Shakespeare poem I included, Sigh No More, which is actually not a sonnet, it's a song from his play Much Ado About Nothing, my all-time favorite comedy play. It's great, go watch the movie. But the Mumford & Sons song from Lesson 1 is also called Sigh No More, right? So you could easily engage with that. What are they doing? How are they revamping Shakespeare? And also the song The Cave by Mumford & Sons clearly draws on the Odyssey, right? Ulysses is depressed, he misses home, he's got to come out of his cave on Calypso's island in March 4th. So if you want to look at how either of those songs engage, either with how The Cave engages with the Odyssey for part 1 or how Sigh No More engages with Shakespeare's Sigh No More for part 2, have at it. That could be a lot of fun. Okay, last section here. We're almost done, I promise. And again, this will be the longest lecture because there's so much to cover. They'll start getting shorter from this point on. A conceit is a long, extended metaphor where a metaphor compares two things that aren't necessarily similar, but they're usually, kind of similar, a little bit similar. Conceit is a metaphor that compares really different things to make the illustration, to make the point. It started with Petrarch, and we have an example of Shakespeare here. But right after Shakespeare, in the early 17th century, a group of poets called the metaphysical poets really took it to another level. The title metaphysical indicates they engaged with spiritual concepts. So, obviously in that sense they took it to another level, but even more so, they made it a long, extended metaphor. So John Donne is the most prominent, most well-known, and I would argue best metaphysical poet. While his wife was alive, he wrote all his poems about his wife. After she passed, he became a pastor and he wrote all his poems about God. But even when he was writing about his wife, there was still this strong spiritual element. He would invent entire new concepts to describe how much he loved his wife, and then pick something seemingly unrelated and extend the metaphor all the way through the poem to illustrate this new concept he invented to describe his marriage. That's a conceit. And it was so impressive that the poet T.S. Eliot in the 20th century, who's one of the most famous poets ever, said, hey, we need to pay more attention to John Donne and the metaphysical poets, because there is a puzzle for the mind, unlocking all the secrets of these conceits. And so the metaphysical poets really came back into prominence 300 years later in the 20th century, and they're still influential today because the conceit is so singular and unique. So for instance, like in the ecstasy, John Donne invents this concept of the ecstasy to show how much he loves his wife and the kind of special union they have, and then uses a conceit to illustrate it. I'm going to take us to the most obvious, easiest example, which is a valediction forbidden mourning. In this, the conceit is the two-legged compass that we saw on that earlier graphic at the start of part 2 of the lecture. So I'm just going to look at 8 lines here that explain the conceit. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two so, as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show, to move but doth, if the other do. So, if you've seen one of those twin compasses before, you put one leg in the middle, and that leg always stays there. And then you open it up, and you can extend the other leg out to different places to draw a perfect circle, etc. But they're always connected, the two legs of the compass, and one always stays rooted. From cultural context, we know that John Donne is the speaker of this poem, that he wrote it when he was leaving on a business trip for his wife. And he says, our union is so strong, so powerful, that we are never actually apart, even when I'm in a different country traveling for work, because we are like the two legs of a two-legged compass. There the conceit comes in. And if she is staying there in England and he's going Italy or Greece or somewhere, wherever you went, that other leg extends out to wherever he is, but it's always connected to that main leg that anchors it, which is her. No one's ever described the marital union that way. And John Donne took something as mundane as a two-legged compass to so perfectly encapsulate it. It's like a brand new idea, but with just that image of the two-legged compass, you can see it and you get it. That's the beauty and the power of the conceit. Again, I've got 3 other Donne poems. What's really fascinating is boasting was sometimes a part of the metaphysical tradition, and here he's boasting. He's saying, our union is so strong, we're so connected even when we're apart, like the two-legged compass, that I will not allow you to mourn. You can't be sad over me being gone. I'm not actually gone. We're not actually apart because we're so connected like this compass. And in The Sun Rising, another poem I gave you, one of my favorites, he boasts about how great his marriage is by basically boasting the sun at the sun and saying it's better. So kind of the opposite of what you had on that Renaissance tradition of sonnets, but coming right on the heels of it. It's so interesting how one literary movement is often a reaction to the previous one. And after his wife passed, sadly, when they were still quite young, he became a pastor, and then he started writing holy sonnets. And those are great too. Holy Sonnet 10, Death Be Not Proud, one of the greatest poems ever. I wish I could just assign you more poems, but we only have so much time. So there's plenty to still write about with this poem. There's also the 3 other Donne poems, the 3 Shakespeare poems. So this is our first lesson. That's like a traditional lesson for our class. So there's 2 lists of questions you need to answer, a question from list 1 on the Odyssey, and then a question from list 2 on either one of these Donne poems or one of the Shakespeare poems. You can pick which one, just 1 question per list. You can also, for the lyric poetry, not the narrative, the lyric, you can also just give your interpretation. In your 250 plus words, give a summary of what the poem's about, what you think its message is, textual support, explanation. Or you can answer one of the questions if you want some specific guidance. You'll see that on the discussion board assignment. It's up to you. My favorite part of the class is reading your ideas, so I can't wait to see what you come up with in the discussion board. Hopefully this lesson was helpful to seeing how ancient Greek epic narrative poetry, the Renaissance sonnet, and the metaphysical poetry of the 17th century all impacted and shaped the course of poetry. We'll continue to see their influences as we go forward, just as even now we already see their influences in the Mumford & Sons songs.